Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for joining our first Monash Sustainable Development Institute Research Seminar Series for 2022. I hope you've all had a nice break over the summer and feeling refreshed and relaxed. I'm sure we're all looking forward to a productive and less disruptive year this year. For those who don't know me, my name is Cameron Allen. I'm a research fellow at MSDI. I joined in September last year, and I'm working in the research team as the science lead on the next UN Global Sustainable Development Report with Shirin. I'd like to start by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nations, on whose land the Monash campuses are located in Melbourne, and also the Turrbal and Jagera people on whose land I'm located here in Brisbane, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So to kick off the seminar series, I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Dominique Coy, who is Senior Program Coordinator at MSDI. She's working with myself and other colleagues across the research and policy impact teams on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's really great to have Domi on board to help coordinate the consultations that we're having in Australia and the Pacific on the Global Sustainable Development Report. So Domi completed her PhD at MSDI. I'm sure many of you probably know her. And her research focused on on community empowerment in energy transformations. She's previously worked in environmental community advocacy roles, and she holds a Master in Environment and Policy and Economics and a Bachelor of Psychology and Neuroscience. She applies different methods to understand how to facilitate stakeholders to engage in inclusive and sustainable change. So today, Domi is going to be presenting on the praxis of empowerment, facilitating community empowerment in energy transformations, which will no doubt include some of the key insights from her PhD thesis. So just to let you know, we're recording the session. There'll be plenty of time at the end after the presentation for questions. So feel free to put questions you may have in the chat or to raise your hand at the end of the presentation. So thanks very much, Domi. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Cameron. All right, well, I'll start with the awkward, make sure everyone can see my screen gag. Thanks, Kim. I guess before I get started, I'd actually just like to take a moment to say that this is a pretty cool moment to be here and giving the presentation to MSDI, the institute that I did my PhD at, and sort of having a bit of a full circle moment. So to acknowledge that, and also just to say thank you to my supervisors, but also my incredible colleagues at MSDI who played a pretty significant role in ensuring that I got to the point where I could give this kind of presentation at the end of my PhD. So thanks, team. So as Cameron said, today I'll be presenting to you on my PhD research, which was looking at how we can cultivate community empowerment within energy transformations. And also just to acknowledge that this PhD was carried out in partnership with the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. So to start off, what is an energy transformation? Well, typically when we talk about energy transformations, we're talking about shifting from fossil fuel based energy sources to renewable energy resources. However, that's just one aspect of what energy transformations can be. Included within an energy transformation is also the idea that we're building towards ostensibly a better world. So we're wanting to avoid the worst effects of climate change, but also potentially foster sustainable development. And we can see that through the explicit targets and goals in the IPCC reports, as well as in the Sustainable Development Goals. And underlying this kind of, I challenge you to think of the energy transformation as a broader movement towards these goals, which we are underlying with this technological innovation, with trillions of dollars being spent on all different types of technologies to ensure that we meet these goals. However, a crucial component of energy transformations is also social transformation, in how people relate to energy, use energy in their daily lives, but also how energy is a key part of our society, culture, and economy. And really, we're seeing a key shift occurring at the moment in terms of people as households, as communities, really owning, producing, and consuming their own energy resources, and potentially opening the door for social transformation leading to the empowerment of these people. So this is a really important feature because we know that when communities are meaningfully engaged in sustainability and climate initiatives, we get better outcomes, we get broader, faster uptake. However, it's important that when we're moving towards this, that we understand how communities are being involved and what basis they're being involved and how we can get them more involved. And this is where I bring in the idea of empowerment. Now, I'm sure when I mention this word, all different things flash across your mind. Is it about people having access to information and resources? Is it about huge structural change? Is it about getting people together and networking? Well, according to the academic literature, it's all of those things, more, potentially less, we're not quite sure. So empowerment is basically a really under-theorized concept in the academic literature. Typically, when we talk about power, it's actually, empowerment is actually in relation to theories of power itself, rather than being theorized in its own right. And we really lack an understanding of what sort of processes contribute to empowerment occurring, and indeed what it actually looks like when people are empowered. And this can be really problematic because it often results in empowerment being used as a buzzword. And this actually risks hiding or normalizing marginalization and inequality within energy. So for some examples, how has empowerment been spoken about in energy? Well, it's typically related to quite an economic framing. So people are positioned as consumers, users, and customers. And empowerment is thought to occur through ensuring that products are designed specifically with the customer in mind. Otherwise, it's also been linked to this idea of social acceptance of technology. So the more power people feel like they have in relation to technology, the more that they're going to accept the big changes that come with renewable energy. Or it's been positioned as the highest form of engagement that an energy company can have with their consumers. However, this is all a little bit problematic as it's putting people in a box with how they use their energy. It's saying to you, you have an option to decide what you're going to buy. It's telling them that we will give you the infrastructure for how you can think and the choices that you can make, rather than letting people really take their energy decisions into their own hands. However, this is changing somewhat with the rise of community energy initiatives. So community energy can roughly be described as a renewable energy or energy efficiency project that a community delivers or benefits from. Now, when we're talking about empowerment in relation to community energy, typically we're talking about people becoming empowered from being involved in these projects. And so this can look like they've become involved in a project and suddenly there's broad social, economic, or technological change in their community. However, more and more we're finding that just because you achieve that technological change doesn't actually mean that you are empowering communities. Communities are still not really out there being in control of projects or making their own decisions. And in the cases where we do see the large social, economic, and technological change, this tends to occur within a subset of the community anyway. So people who have the time, the money, the resources to get involved in these kinds of projects, which really begs the question if we're looking at community energy as something that people receive empowerment from, are we just empowering the people who are already empowered within a community? So I flipped this framing a little bit and wanted to look at empowerment as a way to get people involved in community energy. And really what this means is that we're building people's capacity and capability to get involved in these projects, with communities taking their own actions to access the things that they need in order to be involved in these projects. And this is quite an innovative framing within the energy literature. So I'm sure you're all thinking now, well, how did she do it? Well, I had a 3-part process where I started off with reviewing the sustainability literature to really understand how we've used empowerment, how it's been conceptualized, what its definitions are, what its processes and outcomes are, to really tease apart those ideas. To then build together and start creating my own conceptual framework. I then empirically assessed this conceptual framework through a series of case studies across Victoria. And finally, I performed what's called multi-criteria mapping interviews to really explore perspectives within the communities about what community empowerment could be in energy and how we can go about achieving it. So I just want you to take a moment to sort of think to yourself very quickly, how would you define community empowerment in your own mind? What sort of things are you thinking about? What features are you drawing on? Because within my, my review, I actually found that empowerment is almost a two-part concept. So it's about the process of individuals or groups increasing their capacity, but also their relational power to help meet their own goals, most importantly, leading to their transformative action. And we can really break this definition up into 4 key ideas of empowerment. So to begin with, we have the participation level, where it's kind of empowerment light or entry-level empowerment, where communities start to influence some of the decision-making around renewable energy. They get involved in resource management and start driving towards very particular outcomes. Following the participation, some communities move on to this idea of agency, where they're really starting to formalize into their own groups to organize and act themselves to make choices and respond to problems. After this, there's this idea of autonomy. So here communities are less responding to what's going on around them and more driving change in their own right. They're taking actions, they're finding the resources that they need in order to meet their own personal values and goals when it comes to energy. And then finally, we have this idea of power shift, where communities really build power over resources. They're in control, they're wanting to innovate, they're going out and finding what they need in order to carry out these projects, and they have real ownership over their problems. So this was kind of, I guess, a 4-level idea of empowerment that I developed through my research. And underlying these ideas of empowerment are particular drivers or processes. And this was categorized using a model of social and behavioral change. So I'm just going to put it up there and say there was an overwhelming amount of things that actually contributed to communities experiencing a sense of empowerment. Importantly, there wasn't just things that happened to individuals. There had to be changes right from the spectrum of the individual all the way up to policy and systems in order for a community to experience empowerment. So at the individual level, some of the most important things were people feeling a sense of self-efficacy, like they could take on these kinds of projects, having an attitude that meant that they felt quite positive and motivated about these projects, as well as obviously having an interest in it and an intent to do something. At the interpersonal level are some of those things I mentioned before. So often we see the kinds of people getting involved in community energy projects are those that have some of the time, the resources and the money in order to do so. At the community level, what was really important was like the community dynamic. So how people actually worked together and related with each other in order to bring about these projects, as well as their awareness of emerging alternatives. So I guess no community really wanted to be out there on the forefront. They wanted to know that there were other people who'd been involved in these projects and achieved a bit of success in order to drive them through as well. And then at the societal level, so we have meta norms, which are broadly the norms about norms. So these unwritten rules of society. So here we have this, for communities to start to feel empowered, there had to be this idea that communities actually had a place within the renewable energy transformation and had a significant role to play. And as part of that, there needed to be a removal of some structural barriers. So things like, whether the infrastructure was appropriate, whether the transmission grid meant that a community in northwestern Victoria actually could get involved in this renewable energy transformation, as well as the communication environment. And so this was quite important in terms of having communities talk to other communities. So having people who they trusted sharing information amongst each other. And finally, empowerment is not all just about the communities themselves. It's also about the structures in which they're operating. So whether governing entities, whether they be within the energy sector themselves or within the government, are actually open to allowing community voice and participation in decision-making around energy. So this was what the review found in terms of the drivers that were very important in general for community empowerment. However, when I got to the case studies, I found that there are actually some very specific regional differences. And specifically that empowerment had quite a spatial and temporal dimension in terms of how it unfolded. So the three communities I looked at were Hume, Barwon Southwest, and the Loddon Mallee. Hume's a really interesting area in that they actually have quite a strong history of empowerment already in terms of I believe it was around 20 to 30 years ago, the petrol station in their region was being taken out. And obviously they strongly objected to this because they needed petrol to move around their communities. And so they actually crowdsourced and funded their own cooperative petrol station within their community in order to keep things local. And now, whilst this seems like a bit of a disparate idea within the community, it actually meant that when the Hume communities were coming towards renewable energy, they had a strong history of empowerment that they were already building from. They had things like that community dynamic already in place, as well as like group beliefs in their ability. And they also understood that in order to be successful, they actually needed to build partnerships with the energy sector and start to create their own funding streams to become self-sufficient. Now, Barwon Southwest was slightly different in that they didn't have that same strong history of empowerment within their region. So how they came at their community energy projects and empowerment was a little bit different, where they created a vision for what they wanted to achieve with community energy within their region. And they had very strong leaders within the community energy groups who are helping to facilitate that group vision, and most importantly, focus on inclusivity within those groups. And this meant that whilst they didn't have previous expertise, they could actually start to build that expertise amongst themselves and start to seek more of a voice within energy decision-making. And then within the Loddon Mallee, so this once again was quite different to the other two regions in that there was actually quite a few energy professionals who were around already. And so they had some experience with the energy sector, some connections within the sector, as well as some business experience. So they actually came from things in a very different direction to what those in Hume did, who were coming at it with more of a community-minded empowerment mindset, whereas Loddon Mallee came at community energy with like a very business outlook. However, they were quite important with advocating for communities' role within energy transformations very early on in the Victorian transformation in terms of getting regulation change. And they've really built up their technical expertise and actually shared that technical expertise in order to secure funding for further projects. And so what I've really found here was that previous experience of empowerment built empowerment within these groups. However, how empowerment spread across regions within Victoria was quite different and constrained by different factors. However, broadly, if I was to bring all of those learnings together and give you a 3-step ingredient for community empowerment in energy, or 3-step recipe, sorry, what I would say is that it's important at the start of a community's empowerment journey that they define problems themselves. So they make group decisions based on their previous experience, whether it be in empowerment or energy, that are strongly grounded within their values, their own knowledge and skills in order to define what they're working on and how they're working towards it, and indeed what a community energy group means to them, in order to have shared perimeters that they're all working in. Once groups had that strong idea of their own identity and what they're working towards, there was actually a significant networking proponent where groups were sharing their learnings both within their region, so within the various small communities within the region, but also between the regions. And this built quite a diverse community of community energy projects in Victoria, as you had people with a lot of different skills and experience sharing information. And this was actually better for helping communities experience a sense of empowerment, because they were sharing information with each other amongst trusted sources, and also showing each other that they had a role to be playing within the energy transformation. However, this sort of only got communities so far when we're thinking about those different, that step idea of what empowerment means. And really, in order for communities to be reaching those top ideas of autonomy and power shift, what needed to occur was political change. And so this really involved communities engaging in political advocacy to ensure that their voices were heard and to shift decision-making patterns. And this could be by communities getting out, creating petitions and building momentum within their broader community, or through community energy groups actually fostering partnerships with their local political representatives. And if you're more interested in that, I really encourage you to go have a look at the work that Helen Haynes is doing with community energy out in Indi in Victoria. And what was really important about communities actually ensuring that their voices were heard was that engagement that they built with government and industry, and started planting those seeds of mutual trust between community, government and industry to ensure that this empowerment and community involvement in energy could occur. But obviously for that to happen, government and industry had to be prepared to change as well. So that was my scoping review and then case studies. And for the third study, what I was doing was trying to really look at and understand different perspectives around community energy within the sector. So talking to communities, governments, and NGOs to figure out which options for empowerment they preferred and what were the reasons they preferred them. So as a short little reminder, so from my review, I found these 4 different options for empowerment. And through the case studies, we turned these options for empowerment into more concrete ideas, I guess, around how energy governance can occur. So at the participation level, communities are invited to give early and direct feedback on renewable energy initiatives and how they'd like to benefit from them. However, it's really important to say, for this to actually be empowering, it can't be communities just yelling into the void. Government and energy service providers have to demonstrably act on this feedback and show that they're willing to listen and take on community ideas. This idea of agency, so here we had communities really advocating for their vision for community energies as a group, once again with government and energy service providers having to respond to this vision. For autonomy, we saw communities becoming equal partners with government and energy service providers in decision making and the implementation of community energy initiatives in their region. And for those of you who are familiar with the energy sector within Victoria, this idea of autonomy was really reflected in the community power hubs projects run by Sustainability Victoria. And finally, at the power shift level, here communities were in complete control of the decision-making and implementation of community energy initiatives in their region. However, given that energy is a sector with a lot of different stakeholders and a lot of important technical components as well, it was important to acknowledge that even at this power shift level, there had to be some support and interaction with governments and network service providers. And here, a really good example would be what's gone on with Hepburn Wind in Victoria, where communities raise money for and own some of their own wind turbines. So, given these 4 options and the stakeholders who I spoke to, so they were community, government, and NGOs, I'd just like you to have a moment, or even if you want to throw it into chat, to think about which option for empowerment was preferred across these 4 options with governments, communities, and NGOs. So, broadly speaking, across all participants, we saw that there was a large spread in preferences for these different options. However, there were a few trends. So participation and agency tended to be assessed in a pretty similar way in terms of preference for whether these were what energy governance should be aiming for. And autonomy and power shift were also assessed in a relatively similar way. However, across all participants, it was actually the power shift option which came out as preferred, which was quite interesting. But when we dive into this further by looking at the various different participant groups, we see that communities are strongly in favour of this idea of power shift. They all acknowledge that participation occurs, and whether it's useful or not, they had some differing opinions on. Agency was assessed quite interestingly in that a lot of communities didn't see the value of it anymore because they'd been engaging in it for so long. Autonomy, because there's evidence of this occurring through those community power hub programs, was assessed pretty positively. But at the end of the day, power shift is really what communities wanted to see occurring. For NGOs, this was quite interesting. So their top option was actually autonomy. And the reasoning they had behind this was because autonomy is more of a shared form of governance between community members, governments, and energy service providers. And so NGOs saw this as actually being the more supportive option for community empowerment within energy, where communities didn't have to have all of the answers all of the time, but they could learn and build and be facilitated through the process. And finally, governments. Now, I will preface this with, when I gave this presentation to my partners at DELP, they were surprised by this answer as well. So governments preferred power shift, albeit it was very tight, but in terms of their average preference for how energy governance empowered communities, they liked the idea of power shift because it essentially recognized the idea that governments can't do all of the things all of the time, even for very important services like energy. So having communities really take control and help drive things is actually really helpful and beneficial for governments. So whilst I've been describing some of the reasoning behind these preferences, as I've talked through these diagrams with you, we can go into a little bit more depth on this as well. So the reason underlying some of the preferences, communities really, when they were talking about which option was better, placed a lot of emphasis on how they were engaged. So they wanted to ensure that there was, within energy engagements, there was a strong focus on including community voices, but also responding to community voices in a really appropriate way. And we can see that as well with this idea of that engagement kind of needed to be community-centered. And I will also just take a moment to say that this was a space where traditional owners who were involved in the community energy sector in Victoria had a lot of wisdom and knowledge to share in terms of how we can do these appropriate engagements and really make sure that they are community-centered and focused. So that was the community's main reasons underlying their preferences. However, for government, it was a slightly different story. Whilst they also saw engagement as really important in terms of governance, they had a very large focus on whether the project was feasible. So This was in terms of whether it could get up in with communities having the right resources, even in terms of whether it was in the right place in terms of the electricity grid. And however, they weren't talking about feasibility in terms of just it being a black and white issue. They were also talking about feasibility being really important for community empowerment, in that if communities are getting involved in energy projects that ultimately end up not being feasible, that's actually quite a disempowering experience and may prevent them from going on to get involved in further energy projects. So they placed a high value on that feasibility idea. And NGOs actually really focused on this idea of support. So in order for, they preferred this idea of autonomy because communities could receive the support that they needed to be involved in energy transformations. And that it wasn't kind of just focusing on the already empowered members of communities in general. So this is where my third study left me, and that left me with some really important questions, actually, in recognizing that whilst community energy is a growing and important aspect of the energy transformation, it's not the only aspect of our energy system that's undergoing transformation. So it's quite important to think about, well, what is empowerment in energy beyond community energy? And for this, I really believe governance is key. So how we're involving, whether it be individuals, households, or communities in energy decision-making will really determine how empowered they can be. Whether, to take it back to my definition, it's their transformative action within energy that's occurring. And this really involves the energy system moving from this idea of we have energy consumers who we give all the options to, they just choose, and then we'll go off and do it for them, to this idea of energy citizens. So people actually having the right to be involved in decision-making around something as important and complex as a public service like energy. And it's about, so in order to kind of foster this idea of energy citizens, it's also about finding unique ways to include community voices in energy decision-making and start to decentralize decision-making away from those key stakeholders. So some of the governance frameworks exploring this decentralization of authority in energy include this idea of polycentrism. So there's multiple different decision-making areas. I will say as well, I'm not an expert in governance, but these are just some interesting ideas I came across. So co-evolution, so looking at the different ways we can evolve our governance system. This idea of multi-level governance, so acknowledging that, you know, there's multiple stakeholders involved in energy from federal, state, council, community, and that each of them actually have a role to play in energy decision-making. And finally, participatory or collaborative governance. So actually thinking through ways that we can have multiple stakeholders involved in energy governance in a way that is participatory and equal and inclusive. So yeah, these are for potential next steps for research to take my thesis to another area, is starting to think through some of these governance ideas. But just as a little recap before we move on to questions. So through my thesis, what I really did was come up with a framework for how we can cultivate community empowerment. And this included a novel definition of community empowerment that focused on a community's own transformative action once their capabilities and relational power had increased. An understanding of the processes, so to say, here are some of the things we actually need to focus on if we want to cultivate that sense of empowerment in communities. And an idea of the outcomes, what are we actually driving towards when we're talking about community empowerment? And this is really important because if different stakeholders have different ideas about what community empowerment means, they're driving towards different outcomes, which ultimately will result in communities not being at the center of their own empowerment and often having their idea of empowerment not achieved. And I think it's really important to say that a fundamental principle throughout this research was ensuring that it was built on input from the key stakeholders. So the communities themselves, those who experience the empowerment, I really tried to put a very large focus on what are those communities saying themselves, because at the end of the day, they are the experts in their own empowerment, but also understanding that energy is a pretty broad system with a lot of different stakeholders, and that we need to have everyone on board if we're going to come up with an idea of community empowerment that we're working towards. And so as final takeaway messages, really what we have to say is that communities want power shift. They want that highest level of empowerment. They want to be in control of the decision-making around energy. However, that government and NGOs also support this idea of power shift. So this isn't just a pipe dream that we're talking about in the Victorian energy transformation. This is something that could be achievable, as most stakeholders within energy are on board. However, with a very important caveat, I didn't actually get to talk to many industry stakeholders over the course of the PhD. This wasn't for a lack of trying. It could just have been that PhD research isn't always the most important for energy industry stakeholders, or that this maybe isn't a conversation that energy industry is ready for quite yet. And we can see that in some of how they talk about empowerment in their standard documents. But it is something that most other stakeholders are on board with, and so something that we should be really actively engaging the energy industry in conversations around. That's it. And I've realized that I've absolutely blown through this presentation today. So if you have any questions or want me to elaborate on anything, please feel free to ask. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Domi, for a fantastic presentation. That's some really interesting insights into community transformations in the energy sector, and I think very useful in terms of the practical insights that you've been able to extract from that research. So I'm going to open the floor to comments. If anyone has a question or a comment, feel free to raise your hand. I've got quite a long list of people here, so I'll try to look out for raised hands, or you can also place a question in the chat. I think we have one from Alejandra.
Hi, thanks, Domi. This was super interesting and great to listen. I'm just thinking, did you cover or did your research cover a little bit about the capabilities needed for power shift? And is the community aware of those capabilities needed? And the same for government. I mean, I know government narrative supports power shift, but in practice, it's also really hard for them to let go, or to know how to let go and how to manage basically the shift in decision making. So wondering if that capability side, like, did you look at it?
Yeah, so I touched on it a little bit through, I guess, exploring those enablers of empowerment. So in terms of communities, they had a pretty good idea of the things they actually needed in order to achieve power shifts. However, that idea really varied across Victoria. Like, I think those regional differences really played into the capabilities that they placed emphasis on. So for the community groups who were already quite well-established communities in their own right, they were really looking at, they need the resources in order to be involved in the energy system, in terms of having the information required, the access to experts to get reports, like feasibility reports and business cases put together and those sorts of things. However, for communities that didn't quite have that really strong foundation as a community group yet. They were placing a lot of emphasis on, I guess, those group dynamics themselves. So they were more about ensuring that they had leaders who could, I guess, facilitate the groups through the empowerment and energy process, and ensuring that, I guess, no voices were overriding others, and that I guess they had the skills that they needed, because obviously at the end of the day, energy is quite a technical space. And so you need people involved in these community energy groups, often who have a business background or some sort of project management background or those sorts of things, to help these projects come to life. From a government perspective, I think it's quite interesting, the energy sector in Victoria, because often a lot of the people who I spoke to from government were people who are actually quite involved in community energy groups in their communities already. So they were kind of wearing two hats a lot of the time. And that's why I think we've got programs like the Community Power Hub programs that have popped up, where you've got government who has kind of acknowledged the fact that communities are quite switched on and they are ready to be involved in energy. However, they do need help with those little things like the getting the expertise and having the skills in place. So the point of the Power Hubs program is to provide communities with the resources that they need in order to take those first steps towards power shift. And then to also help communities start to develop their own funding streams around renewable energy, and to kind of help network and connect them to ensure that when government is ready to take a step back and maybe not support communities as much, that communities are ready to really take on that mantle within energy themselves. So it's quite an interesting project, and not really one that I've seen replicated even with other sectors within Victoria, let alone in kind of other energy projects around the world. But I would say that within government, and indeed within communities, like, this is a really small sector where they understand these things. Broader community isn't necessarily always on board for community energy. So a lot of the work that these community energy groups are doing is kind of, I guess, educating and trying to build that interest within the community, the broader community. And also trying to figure out how they can get people involved who are maybe from a lower socioeconomic status, who don't have the very simple things like time in order to be involved in these projects. And then within government, and that's why I've really highlighted in my talk as well, that the traditional owners were the ones who had such a clear understanding of how we can start doing this shared decision making and collaborative governance, and such a deep understanding of the different principles that were required from government and energy service providers in order for something like power shift to occur. But that understanding of, like, I guess to take it back to your question, that understanding of the capabilities wasn't within all of government. It was quite siloed at times.
Okay, thanks, Tommy. Next, I have Janata, is it? I'm sure if I pronounced that right.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. And thanks, Dominique, for sharing such interesting research and findings. I was wondering how community energy empowerment could be applied and sustained in the government or / privately driven with an unbundled energy market like Indonesia, for instance, that to some extent limit the community participation. Or maybe put it this into another words, how to match the government-induced energy transformation vision at the local level with the community-driven energy transformation visions at the governance framework that you have been discussing. So to help you contextualize my questions. I'm talking about the coal to clean energy transformations for the Indonesian coal producing regions as the main topic. Thank you.
Right, so I think this is a really interesting question, because I think a big acknowledgement that I have to make about my research is that Victoria seems very unique in how they're driving community involvement within energy, and the emphasis that they're placing on it. And that comes from multiple different places. So it's quite community driven in that a lot of these projects were very regional. So it was communities who were on the edge of our electricity grid who often didn't have or who often experienced blackouts on really hot days, or when there were bushfires, or the fact that their towns were at extreme bushfire risk because of things like power lines and those sorts of things. So I guess it's hard to say without being like an expert and with acknowledging that there is that difference. But I guess in an energy grid where you're still sort of trying to build towards that stability or even that transition, there would, because I guess the whole, sorry, I'm feeling my way through this answer as I go. So I guess, you know, an energy transformation is fundamentally built on distributed energy resources. We can't have everything in one place like we have typically. And so having communities be involved with those distributed energy resources is actually really important, because it's often on community lands that these things are having to be built, or the transition lines are having to go through, and communities often have very strong feelings about these developments in their areas. So I guess from the first point of call, there needs to be an acknowledgement within transformations, which I'd say has happened in Victoria, but maybe from your question hasn't quite happened in Indonesia yet, is that this is a distributed phenomenon that is going to fundamentally involve more stakeholders than what the energy system has before. And once you start moving from that premise, then that opens up options that communities can actually help governments in terms of this transformation fairly significantly by trialing different technologies in their area, and by I guess playing a really active role in transformations. And so perhaps before the really concrete things need to happen, there needs to be more of a paradigm shift in terms of how governance and the rollout of the transformation is thought about. In terms of what communities can do for that, I mean, it's quite difficult. When you start throwing in, I guess, levels of development and socioeconomic status, like even in Australia, there's a large divide between the people who have access to the resources in order to get involved in these projects and the people who don't. And so often it's the role of NGOs to step in to help these projects develop and actually support communities through this. So I guess at a fundamental level, it's about ensuring that communities have the interest, and even just at the awareness that these projects are possible and get involved, and often that they can benefit pretty substantially from it, even if it's just having more reliable energy or making money by selling that energy to whoever owns the grid. So I guess helping communities understand that there's benefits for them to help build towards wanting to be more active as well. And that's, I guess, a very step. So, but also quite difficult to achieve, you know, a fundamental paradigm shift in how you think about energy, no biggie. But hopefully that answered your question a little bit.
Thanks, Dominique.
No worries.
Thanks, Domi. Great answer. Next, I have Kim.
Hey, Domi. I love hearing you talk. I've heard many of your talks about your PhD, but I realized as I was listening this time that I've never asked this question, and it's going to sound dumb. So this might be a really quick answer, or it might be a really convoluted answer. We'll see. You were defining empowerment, and I love that. I've seen that evolve over the years, which is been great. But in one of your answers before, you were talking about community energy groups and then the general community. And it made me realize and embed this question in my head about when you talk about communities, what do you actually mean? So I come very much from an individual behavior change lens. So I'm thinking very much about individuals or households or, you know, other actors that you can easily draw a line around. Through your research and maybe even just more generally, what are you actually talking about when we're talking about communities?
Okay, cool. Well, you and my thesis examiner both had that question to ask him. So, I mean, it's a really, really tricky question, right? Because you can define community in so many different ways. But one of the framings that I really like, well, first and foremost, so one of the failings, I guess, that's actually happened in Victoria is when the government's come in to say, right, community energy, let's talk communities. They've said a community is this geographical boundary. And a lot of the communities involved in this project has been like, no, it isn't. Like, we don't, that's not how we think about ourselves. We are not Hume. We are like, we're Beechworth or we're Bright or those sorts of things. So I guess the first way I could answer that is a bit of a cop-out and say, well, it's how communities define it themselves. But I think there's more of like a fundamental part of that as well. And the framing of community that I really like is that we can define community based on interest or based on locality. So the community, like a community energy group can be in the town of Beechworth, and it can involve, you know, the people who are really passionate about these energy projects, and like small businesses and even representatives from local council, and that can be what makes up a community energy group. But then more broadly across Victoria, we're seeing these huge networks of community energy groups that kind of span massive distance, and they're really brought together by their interests, their shared interest in these projects. So I think it's a pretty fuzzy boundary, and one that communities should be making themselves. But yeah, broadly locality and interest. But also thank you for coming to what's probably like the 7th time you've heard me talk about my PhD. Much appreciated.
Well, thanks, Domi. Next up is Paris. Thanks
for a really engaging talk. This is, yeah, really up my alley, especially what I'm working on at the moment at MSDI. I have a couple of questions. Hopefully they're not too complicated, but firstly, I was wondering if there was an instance where a community initiative led to wider institutional change, such as how the energy market is regulated. And secondly, and this is a bigger question, I suppose, it was interesting to see the community desire and explicit government support for power shift, and some of the impetus for these programs stemming from, I guess, the failure of market provision in those edge of grid areas. So I was wondering whether these models have the potential to scale and effectively challenge business as usual for profit energy provision through perhaps market share changes or shifts, and whether these questions are even being debated, or is community energy seen as a real kind of local niche that's going to kind of evolve but not really change how energy is not change the broader energy system, I guess.
Yeah, okay. Well, luckily, I think I have an example for each of those questions. So in terms of communities changing that regulatory environment, so Bendigo Sustainability Group, who they were one of the Loddon Mallee groups that I spoke about, they came from this place where they had some energy expertise and they had business expertise and they had sort of a bit of backing to go on and start creating these projects. However, at the time, the Victorian regulatory system just wasn't set up for kind of this community energy organisation. So they went to, I think it was Essential Services, like the regulator for Essential Services in Victoria, set up meetings with them. They're like, how can we go and do this and all of that sort of stuff. And they ended up finding out that there was a provision in the regulation for caravans to have their own energy in caravan parks. And so they were able to negotiate with essential services to essentially broaden out this provision so that communities could actually start providing some of their own energy and feeding into the grid as well. And I think that's a really, really great example of where people who have experience in these areas can add so much to the broader transformation and help contribute to community empowerment occurring, because they understand on a really fundamental level what about the system needs to change. And, you know, they're really proud that they were the ones who did that. And that's kind of part of their origin story that they've then gone on to build the broader movement in their area with. So that was a really cool example of that. And then in terms of whether community energy is going to challenge our current business models. So out in the Hume region, they've got this really thriving community energy scene, particularly like totally renewable Yakandanda. I can't remember all of the things, it's variations on 100% and totally renewable and all of that sort of stuff, but Beechworth as well have a really thriving group, and a few of the other smaller areas out around there. And what they've actually managed to do is to build their and become their own network to such a point where a group called Indigo Power have come to the fore. And what Indigo Power is doing is really exciting, because they've aggregated all of these groups to say, well, we have quite a large majority in this region of community energy groups who are providing energy. And so they've gone and almost like a cooperative, I guess, gone to the kind of network service providers and said, well, you can give us better prices, because it's not just one little guy who's doing this anymore. There's a huge group of us who are actively contributing to the energy we have available in the grid. And Indigo Power strongly frame themselves as a social enterprise as well. So all of the profit that they sort of get back from these larger negotiated agreements actually goes back into supporting the communities to, whether it be get more involved in energy or just broader community benefits as well. So there's an aspect of community energy where I guess these groups are moving beyond kind of those real little niches to actively start getting involved in the broader energy system. However, I think a lot of the community energy groups themselves would be the first to acknowledge that they're not the ones that are going to bring about the entire transformation. It's going to take a multi-pronged approach with multiple different stakeholders, and they're just there to advocate, I guess, for being one of those stakeholders at the table. So yeah, I guess to niche or not to niche is still the question for community energy groups.
Well, thanks very much, Domi. I'm just looking at the time. I think we're pretty much out of time. There are a couple of other questions in the chat, but we might have to take those ones offline in the interest of finishing at 1. So a big thanks to Domi for a great presentation. Thanks everyone for giving up your time today to join our session. I've really enjoyed the discussion. It's been really engaging. So round of applause for Domi.
Thank you.
Thank you.